Oh my god. Barf me out and gag me with a spoon. It's the Totally Gnarly Podcast.
Oh, hey there. Sorry, I'm just rocking out to some Go-Go's on my Sony Walkman cassette player. But I want to welcome you to the inaugural episode of the Totally Gnarly Podcast. For those of you who are listening and not watching, I do have a new studio set up for the podcast. Unfortunately, the lighting was not cooperating, so I finally decided just to do the first episode in my regular setting, and I'm going to time myself with my Casio digital watch here. This is not a podcast about the 1980s, although we will occasionally talk about 1980s culture. This is going to be a podcast about whatever's going on currently in the entertainment world, in the social media world. And for those of you who aren't watching, Sybil is here with me. Take a swig of tea from my Barclay Paris Hilton tea mug. We'll be talking about all kinds of things. We're going to have some guests. Rich Lux is going to be coming on as a guest. I've got a couple of other people lined up to come on as guests. So we're going to do a little bit talking, a little bit interviewing, and we occasionally will do them a live stream. But you can also submit topic ideas to me via my email, which is in the description of the podcast. The podcasts are located in the new podcast playlist on my channel on YouTube, and we will also be submitting the audio version to Spotify and a few other places. But for today's inaugural episode, those of you who are not watching, I've got my tennis sweater tied around my neck, and I've got my Wayfarers on, and I've got on my Madras plaid shirt in the vein of the Preppy Handbook, which in the 80s was supposed to be a joke, making fun of the Ivy League set and people who basically old money, as they call it. But it ended up turning into a cultural phenomenon, and it became sort of like a guidebook to people who wanted to dress preppy, and the mainstreaming of like the preppy look. And I mean, even till this day, we still really wear a lot of the same things. So there's not a whole lot different than I'm wearing right now that you wouldn't see out probably somewhere, especially in the summertime. But I had a copy of the Preppy Handbook. I carried it religiously around high school with me and thought it was going to be my guidebook to becoming one of the landed gentry. Well, that didn't happen, but it was a fun way to dress nice and look good in school. And if you've seen any of the 1980s movies, like the Brat Pack, they call it, movies with like Molly Ringwald and Judd Hirsch and a bunch of other people, Anthony Michael Hall, things like Pretty in Pink, The Breakfast Club, etc. You know, you'll see some of that styling through those movies. But anyways, for today's episode, I'm going to take you down memory lane, and I'm going to talk to you about, in particular, 1987, which was the year I turned 21. I know. I shouldn't even divulge that, but a lot of you know that I'm not in my 20s. But it was a very exciting time. I was turning 21 that year. I moved out to Los Angeles, which had been a dream of mine since I was in high school. When I was in high school, I'm quote unquote a bright kid and have a very high aptitude, especially like for English and history and language and things like that. But I hated high school. You know, I got picked on in high school. I was considered a nerd, even though I was dressing all preppy. We didn't have like a cool preppy set in my school. There were a few of us who hung together who were kind of preppy. We weren't part of the mainstream cool kids. We were like the misfits. Well, I hated high school, and I, got through it. But one of the things I used to do is I used to carry around, in addition to the Preppy Handbook, I had a copy of a guidebook to Los Angeles because I wanted to be a movie star so bad. And I did dabble a little bit in acting when I was in high school. But unfortunately, even though I moved to LA, I never followed that dream, and I really regret it to this day. But I was so excited because I was moving to Los Angeles, and one of my dreams was coming true. I had met somebody who was, in my view, totally wonderful, and I thought we were going to live happily ever after, and make it big in Hollywood, and well, that didn't happen. And I ended up eventually moving back to the East Coast where I'm originally from. So it didn't quite go the way I planned. And I'm sure, as a lot of you know, things don't always go the way we plan. But let's talk about 1987. So first of all, I'm not a boomer, I'm Gen X. So I can hear some of you out there calling me a boomer. I'm not a boomer, okay? I'm not that old yet. But, I was very young back then, and we didn't have computers or smartphones, let alone any kind of a cell phone yet. There were car phones, but they were these big, clunky things that were very expensive to get installed. People weren't walking around with phones, okay? And we didn't have on-demand video. I know this is, I feel, you guys have to understand, I don't feel my age. I still feel like I'm in my 20s or early 30s. I don't feel any older than that. So it's really weird when I talk about this stuff, because I feel old only when I talk about things this way, but it's just the way it was, We didn't have computers. I mean, we had computers, but we didn't have like Windows. They were like screens, and you could do they were mostly for accounting and things like that, and word processing. We didn't have the internet, of course. And we didn't have video on demand. So, television was, your show was on once a week. If you missed it and you didn't have a VCR, you were screwed. Okay. We did have VCRs. So yes, we did record programs. But that was it, and then there would be reruns in the summertime. And if you were lucky, you could catch whatever you missed then. So, a lot of life revolved around the TV schedule, because of course we all have shows we like, but because you couldn't watch them on demand, you physically had to be present for them, or like I said, you could record them on the VCR. But I just want to kind of give you an idea of the shows that were really popular in 1987. And some of these, there's a few of these that had been rebooted, which also was kind of weird for me to see shows that suddenly come back. It's the same with movies. Like, all of a sudden, there's all these movies that when I was growing up that are being remade. And it's like, that's when you know you're old, kids. You know you're old, number one, when they start rebooting TV shows you grew up with and remaking movies that you grew up with. But you also know you're old when you go into Home Depot and they're playing music you listened to when you were in high school. Because when I was young, we'd go in and we'd hear like the music that my parents and my grandparents listened to, and we called it elevator music. Well, now they don't play elevator music. They do play like proper songs, but I'm finding that it's all from the 80s right now. And so it's like somebody is just shouting out, hey, you're old now. So, but these are the shows that were the top in 1987, okay? The Cosby Show, and we all know Bill Cosby is no longer the media darling that he was, and was jailed for some horrendous things. Family Ties, which Michael J. Fox starred in. Cheers, which a lot of you may still be aware of, because Cheers is kind of an institution in television. Murder, She Wrote with Angela Lansbury, which was sort of a lighthearted murder mystery show that I liked, and I've heard that they're going to reboot that. The Golden Girls, of course. I hope most of you know the Golden Girls. Betty White just passed away, what was it, a year ago? So that was kind of sad, but she was the last of the Golden Girls. That was an amazing show. That it was so hysterical, and for the time, it was kind of cutting edge. They dealt with topics that people didn't want to touch with a 10-foot pole. 60 Minutes, which of course is still around. Night Court, Growing Pains, Moonlighting, that had Sybil Shepherd and Bruce Willis. Who's the Boss, which had Tony Danza and Judith Light. And Dallas, of course. I sure hope you guys know what Dallas is. They did try to reboot that several years ago, and it went for, 2 or 3 seasons. But then Larry Hagman passed away, who was the original JR. And so after he passed away and was no longer on the reboot, it kind of went into the toilet, and it didn't last. And there was a show called Newhart, which was a comedy, which was hysterical. There was a show called Amen, 227, a show called Matlock, which I think they rebooted. I swear it was on Prime Video or Netflix or somewhere that I saw Matlock. So I don't know whether it's still going or they made a reboot and it didn't make it. I'm not quite sure. And of course, there were things, and again, this goes back to not having on demand. There was the CBS Sunday Night Movie. So they would have like these weekly one-off 1 hour or 2 hour movies that you could watch. And Disney every Sunday night had a special. Monday Night Football, of course. Kate and Allie, which was another comedy that was really funny. The NBC Sunday night movie, LA Law, which was a really good show. It was like the first of the lawyer shows. My Sister Sam, which was a comedy. Falcon Crest, and we're going to talk about primetime soaps in a minute because, oh my God, they were just like, they ruled our world. And the next one coming up is Dynasty, and then there's Knots Landing on this list also of top shows in 1987. And I wasn't really a Knots Landing fan until just a couple of years ago. I actually watched that. It's the longest running of the primetime soaps, and it's about like these families living on a cul-de-sac and like all the trials and tribulations. It was actually a spin-off of Dallas because Gary Ewing and his wife Val are, they are the sibling. Gary's the sibling of JR. He's like the black sheep of the family. But anyways, they live in California, and so there was that spinoff. And then there was Falcon Crest, which was really good. And Angela Channing was the main character, and she was played by Jane Wyman, who actually was Ronald Reagan's first wife. And that was a really good show. And that lasted, I think, for 9 seasons. And it's about the vineyards in California, Northern California, and the dynamics of the Gioberti family and all the wars between the matriarch and the nephew and all of the siblings and stuff. And that was a pretty good show. But my favorite was Dynasty. Dynasty to me was like the only show. If I had to pick one show to watch, it would have been Dynasty. And they did do a successful reboot on the CW, which just ended this past year. I think it went for 5 or 6 seasons. And I watched the reboot. I watched all of the seasons of the reboot, and I really liked it. I thought they did a really good job. They sort of reinvented it. Back in the day when we would watch Dynasty, I mean, there were more episodes every year, and the storylines went on forever. They went on for weeks and weeks. So what they did when they rebooted Dynasty on the CW was they used a lot of the same or most of the same storylines, but they really condensed them. So it was really fast moving, and it also had a really tongue-in-cheek kind of campy humor to it. So it wasn't as dramatic as the real Dynasty. And I thought the cast was really good. I thought they did a really good job on casting. There's only one Blake Carrington for me. That was John Forsythe, who also was the voice of Charlie's Angels, of the Charlie on Charlie's Angels before he did Dynasty. He was such a classy guy with a really distinctive voice, and he'll always be the only Blake for me. And I thought that the character of Fallon was really well cast in the reboot. But again, for me, the top Fallon will always be Pamela Sue Martin, who unfortunately only stayed on for like 4 or 5 seasons, I think. Pamela Sue Martin, who most of you probably don't know now, but she was pretty well known. She had done a show called Nancy Drew, which has also been rebooted, and she played Nancy Drew. There's a movie, I don't know if you've ever heard of The Poseidon Adventure, which she was also starred in, but she played the original Fallon on Dynasty for the first several seasons, and she was like absolutely perfect in that role. And that's another role that there will never be a Fallon that will beat Pamela Sue Martin. And also Alexis, of course, Joan Collins, who, God bless her soul, she's still alive, as well as the character who played Crystal. She's also still alive. But Joan Collins is quite an institution, can I say? But Joan Collins made Dynasty. She came in the second season as Blake's estranged wife, and she's British, for those of you who don't know Joan Collins, and shame on you if you don't. And she just had exactly the right chemistry and the right attitude and everything. And she catapulted Dynasty, in my opinion, single-handedly into the amazing successful show that it was. And I mean, people, this was the 80s when everything was to the excess. Okay. You had Nolan Miller, who was designing all the gowns, and they used real caviar and champagne, and they wore jewels that were real, and it just was everybody wanted to be Dynasty. Everyone wanted that, and because it was the age of anything's possible and do everything to the extreme and to the excess. And, for the brief shining moment that was the late 80s, it was a great time to be alive, and I'm so glad that I lived through it. And when I moved to LA in 87, it was like the peak of that era, and I wanted to embrace that lifestyle, and I did embrace that lifestyle, even though I really couldn't afford it. But anyway, so Dynasty for me was, I'm sorry, those of you listening, Stefan is my deaf cat sneezing in the background. When I was in high school, Dynasty began, and the first season, which I watched from the very first season all the way to the end, the character of Stephen Carrington, who became a controversial topic, struggle between the creators of Dynasty and the studios, because this was the 80s, and, gay people were starting to be accepted, but they still were ostracized, and, you could get fired for being gay, you could not get housing for being gay. And in fact, when I was looking for apartments in LA, I got turned down for an apartment because I was gay. And yes, I'm positive that's why. If you'd seen the look on the woman's face when she saw two men coming for a one-bedroom apartment, I can't describe it, but she was this Beverly Hills bitch who just wasn't going to have two men living in her apartment complex. So I eventually did move somewhere that I really like, and actually my apartment is still there. I saw it on Airbnb not that long ago, and I thought, oh, wouldn't that be kind of fun? But then I got kind of creeped out and thought, I don't know if I want to bring back all those memories, because it was a brand new apartment at the time. The complex was new, and I was the first person, my partner and I were the first people to ever live there. But I don't know if I want to open those memories again. But anyway, so Stephen Carrington sorry, I know I go off on these tangents. So please indulge me for this first episode, okay? Stephen Carrington was openly gay on Dynasty, and he was played by this guy called Al Corley, who was not gay in real life, but who was very committed to the character. He was a very tall, handsome, blonde, curly-haired guy, kind of soft-spoken, but a very, very good actor. And when I saw that character, was the first time I ever had seen a gay character who was portrayed as like a quote-unquote normal person. He didn't walk with a swish. He didn't have a lisp. He didn't, wear all hot pink. And, there were so many horrible, horrible stereotypes back then of what gay people were, that it's really, now to think about it, it's just absolutely cringy to think about the way gay people were portrayed. It was Hollywood portrayed gay people in such a horrible, stereotypical way. It was not at all helpful. But Stephen Carrington was this guy who worked on an oil rig, who came from this wealthy, patriarchal family, and he didn't have a lisp, and he looked and sounded and acted like a quote-unquote man, and he was my hero. And it was like, I lived every week, I think it was on Wednesday nights, Dynasty. I lived to see Dynasty every week. And my mother, because it was on kind of late, I can't remember if it was on 9 or 10 o'clock. But, when you're in high school, that's kind of late. My mom kind of didn't want me to stay up that late, but she did let me watch the show. And I ended up usually being the last person to go to bed because I was watching Dynasty. But Stephen Carrington was my lifeline in terms of having somebody to look up to. And then unfortunately, after the first season, they quote unquote turned Stephen sort of straight, and there was a lot of controversy. And I at first thought it was the writers and the producers who did this, but then I much later learned it was actually the studio, and ABC didn't want this gay character. So he sort of became bisexual. It was very disappointing. Now, I still looked up to the character of Stephen, even though they really screwed around with his life and really angered a lot of people, including me. And he sort of eventually drifted back towards being exclusively gay. It was a really, trust me, it was such a weird thing. But anyway, so Dynasty for me was the show, and Alexis Carrington was this bitchy, powerful, rich woman who didn't take anybody's crap and who generally got her own way, and she was very forceful, and I totally wanted to be her. And now those of you listening know it wasn't a gender thing, and no, I wasn't looking at being trans. I just, for some reason, I liked Alexis, and in my life I've identified with strong women a lot. I don't know why, and again, it has nothing to do with gender or sexuality or anything. It's just, that's just the way it is. Because I guess because powerful women seem a little more sympathetic than powerful men. And back then, being gay, that you couldn't, like, Blake Harrington couldn't be my idol because he was a homophobe, and he was, even though I admire the character of Blake because I would love to have been in his position, I couldn't identify with him. So I just loved Alexis, even though she was totally evil a lot of the time. She was amazing. And one year, I think it was my junior year in high school or my senior year, I can't remember, I dyed my hair black because I wanted to have hair the same color as Joan Collins on Dynasty. And it was a horrible disaster because I'm very fair and I had sort of dirty blonde hair. And I also made the mistake of dyeing my eyebrows. And I can remember coming up, I did it at my grandmother's house down in her basement. She had a shower she had a finished basement and had a shower room. And when I came up, my aunt and uncle and my grandmother, they were all sitting at the table. And when they saw me, they just stopped talking and looked and stared and said, "What did you do?" But the thing is, I went to school, and one of the bullies in school that I was terrified of stopped me in the stairwell between classes. And it was just he and I were the only two people in the stairwell. And he said, "Hey, I admire you. You've got guts to dye your hair." He goes, "But if you ever tell anybody I said that, I'll kill you." So I thought that was so cool. I was like, oh my God, the school bully thinks that I'm kind of cool, that I'm a rebel in my own way. So anyway, so now let's move on because let's talk about Los Angeles. To this day, Los Angeles is one of those mystical places to me. When I got to go with Rich Lux last summer for the infamous Ace Fest, I was so excited because I hadn't been back to LA in a number of years, and I still, to this day, I love Los Angeles. People, you either love it or hate it. I love it. I love Los Angeles. I love the weather. I love the pace of life. I love the fact that there are so many different environments within driving distance. The desert, the mountains, the ocean, the wine country. There's just so much variety. It's very expensive to live there. The people can be jerky, and it's so true. We used to make fun of people in LA and, have a nice day. That was like the cliche thing. They were these empty-headed people who they just would say, "Have a nice day." Well, much to my shock, when I got to LA, I found that there were a lot of people who actually were like that, and they didn't talk about anything really serious. Like, you didn't talk about your problems or anything that was considered to be a downer with people you worked with or who were your acquaintances. And I think that's why there were so many people that go to shrinks out in LA, because they just don't have any support systems. But other than that, I loved it. I got to go out to some of the most amazing restaurants. There was a place called Le Dome, which was this French restaurant that was very exclusive. There was Spago, and this was, a lot of you may recognize the name Spago because it's still in business. It's a chain now, and Wolfgang Puck is still around, and I think he's got even food in the freezer section of the supermarket. But the original Spago was on Sunset Boulevard, and that was like one of the absolute in places. And I went there only once with my partner, and he actually proposed to me at Spago and gave me a diamond ring, which I still have, even though we were only together 9 years. But we were there, and there were people, there were TV personalities there, and I worked at Bullock's department store in Westwood, which I think is now Macy's, because all of these wonderful old time department stores that were in LA that had they had, not only was it clothing, but they had a restaurant, a tea room, a salon, and you could just spend your day. And that's what all the rich housewives of Beverly Hills did. They would go to Bullock's, and they'd go to Neiman Marcus and Saks and Nordstrom and places like that. And there were some other stores like Robinson's, which wasn't like an upscale store, but a bunch of stores just disappeared because May Company, which used to be the parent company of Macy's, I don't know if they still are, basically took over these chains and put them out of business, and everything became Macy's. And now, shopping, the variety just isn't there like it used to be. But I worked at Bullock's, and Bullock's was a nice store. It wasn't like Neiman Marcus, but it was on the upper end. So it was a very nice clothing store. And they did have the store I worked at in Westwood Village, which was right on the edge of the campus of UCLA. There were a lot of famous people would come into our store and shop. And I worked in the credit department. And what I did was I did the store's daily deposit for the bank. So I would take all of the cash register, because there was a lot of cash back then. We didn't have, of course we had credit cards, but we didn't have debit cards, and people still paid a lot in cash. So there would be all the registers of the store would put their deposits in bags, and in the morning I would come in early and I would tally up all the deposits and prepare the deposit for the Brinks people to come and take to the bank. And then when I finished, it was where I worked as in the cashier's office was part of the credit department. So then I would go work out front in the credit department for the other half of the day. And we would have famous people would, believe it or not, come in and pay their credit bills. There were a lot of TV personalities that you guys wouldn't know who they are, but there were the Hope Lang, who was the star of this show back, which actually was before my time. I've seen it. I saw it in reruns growing up, but I was too young when it was on TV. It was called The Ghost and Mrs. Muir. And then there was a show that was really before my time called Route 66. And we had, all these different people that would come in and actually pay their own credit bills. And some movie stars too. And that's where I learned, when I lived in LA, is when I learned not to be starstruck. So when I see famous people today, I don't get all, I might get a little excited, but I just don't get, it's not, I don't want to run up and get their autograph, and I've seen a lot of famous people over the years and been, close up to or sat near in restaurants, and just, it's cool to see them, but, you let them be, and they have their own lives because they're real people too. And so I'm not really starstruck when I see famous people. So that was my life. I would work at Bullock's. I would meet my partner for lunch, and there was this Japanese sort of teriyaki kind of restaurant in Westwood Village, which was the big college hub. There were a lot of movie theaters there. And when I say movie theaters, I mean single historic movie theaters that maybe had a couple of theaters, but they weren't megaplexes. And they did a lot of movie premieres in Westwood. And we would see movie premieres all the time. Not go to them, but we would see the premieres being put on. And we would have our lunch, and Marilyn Monroe was buried over right near where I worked and where my partner worked. And sometimes I would walk over there at lunchtime and visit Marilyn's grave. And then we'd take the long drive home, because traffic, as it is still in LA, is an absolute nightmare. And it would take what would take maybe 20 minutes for me to go from where I lived in the Hollywood Hills to work in Westwood. At night, in the mornings, it was over an hour. So we would have to leave early, and there was this particular route we took to like avoid a lot of the traffic. And so we'd go home, and sometimes we'd go out to dinner, and we'd go out on the weekend to the clubs. And there was a big club that I don't even know if it's still there. It may be, but it's probably called something else. It was called Studio One, and it was like this big old, I think it was like an aircraft hangar or something. I'm trying to remember. I know there's a story about it. It was like a historic building that almost got torn down and then it got saved. But it was this gay nightclub, and it was like huge. And, you know, they had go-go dancers, and it was very exciting. And we'd go there sometimes on the weekend. And there was a place called The Rage on Santa Monica Boulevard in West Hollywood, where we learned, because in California, I don't know if it's still true, but you could have happy hour, which in a lot of states is illegal now. But you had to serve food. So you would pay, I think it was like $5. You'd get a drink, but there was also like a buffet. And it was a good buffet. There was like roast turkey and all kinds of salads and things. So after work, sometimes we'd go to the Rage. We'd have a drink, because it was like midway between home and work. Have a drink, eat at the buffet, so you basically got like free dinner, and then go home and watch TV. So, and then start all over again. But we had a great life. We went to Palm Springs a bunch of times. I really love Palm Springs. That's another place I haven't been in a long time. But I love driving to Palm Springs. It's such an amazing drive out into the desert. And back before wind power windmills were commonplace, out in the California desert on the way to Palm Springs, there was this huge field of windmills, and that was the first time I had ever seen one of them, and it just was an amazing sight. And so you drive through the desert, and then all of a sudden there's this oasis would pop up, and there would be Palm Springs, and there was this hotel called Maxime's of Paris, and it was named after a famous place in Paris, and it was all suites, and we would go there once in a while for an overnight, and you would go lay by the pool, and the pool boys were all dressed in white, and they'd come around and they'd mist you, and they'd bring you drinks, and they had like this misting system built into the overhang, the pergola or whatever that was by the pool, and you would lay there in like the 105-degree heat and get cooled off and sit by the pool. And then at night, when it cooled down, we'd go out to dinner, and there were some interesting clubs out there as well. And there was also the Palm Desert Mall, which is out there, had a skating rink inside, which was kind of cool. You know, it'd be 110 degrees outside. You could go into the Palm Desert Mall and go ice skating. So it was a really interesting time. And it's 1987 for me is like one of those iconic years. And I'm sure everybody has a period of time that was like, stands out in your memory as like really having made an impression on you. And for me, that was 1987. And I'll always secretly wish I could just go back there for just a week and live that life again. And even though that I would miss the technology and everything that we have now, it still was a really fun, cool, fast-paced place to live. I had a friend who he now lives in Florida, but lived in LA and worked in the film business, not on the front side, but on the like the distribution end of it. And he worked like for Universal, and he worked for 20th Century Fox at one point. And he would get us what was called a drive-on pass, which means you could go to the studio and they would let you in through the gate, and we could park. And that was like a big deal. You know, we could park and we could go to what was called the canteen, like where all the TV stars who were filming that day would be eating their lunch. So you'd see famous people eating lunch, and you could go to what was called the company store, and you could buy merchandise that the general public didn't get to see or buy. My friend, he's a really nice guy, and he was a lot of fun to go out with. We'd go out with him in our little Mazda RX-7, and he would have to lay down in the back because it was only a two-seater. And he would take us to all these freaky clubs, like in Silver Lake, which is in Los Angeles. They were like, he liked sort of the seedier side of the nightlife. So we would go to some interesting places, but he would get us all these great private tours and things of the studios. And one time we got to go to 20th Century Fox and got a private tour of the costume vault where they had all famous costumes throughout history from the movies. Dresses worn by Marilyn Monroe and Julie Andrews from The Sound of Music and all these things, and to get to touch and see them was really cool. So it was a really cool time for me, and it brings back a lot of really interesting memories. Let me know, you guys, what you think, what memories you have. What is your favorite year, or what is your favorite time period from your life so far? Whether you're young or you're older, I'd be interested to hear what stands out in your memory when you think back to when you were like around that age, like 21 or in high school. What for you was like the magical year or the magical experience? I'd be interested to hear that. But that is probably going to wrap up this first podcast. I know I've been all over the place, but it's fun to reminisce for me anyways. I hope you guys found it interesting. The next episode will be a little more structured, and we will have a guest, and we will cover things that are not necessarily about the 1980s. And it should be interesting. I thank you guys for coming along. Those of you who are watching, I apologize that it's the same backdrop. I do have a whole new backdrop and props and things for my podcast set, but I've got to work out a few kinks, and I'll try to do that this week so that the next episode I can film with the proper backdrop and everything set up. But thank you so much, you guys, for joining me for this first podcast of the Totally Gnarly podcast. And I hope you will tune in for the next one. I really appreciate you joining me. So I just want to say, I hope you guys have a great night or day whenever you're listening to this. And I hope to see you in the next episode. Take care.